40% of the town in the 1800s. Mostly they earned their livelihood through trade. The alcohol distilling and the selling of alcohol, which was mentioned in the museum, was important. The timber trade, the grain trade, these were all things that Jews were involved in. Jews were also goldsmiths and silversmiths. When the Germans came to Lancut, they basically expelled most of the Jews. Lancut was on the border between where the Germans and the Soviets partitioned Poland in September 1939. And what the Nazis did was they drove the Jews forcibly to the river and forced many of them to cross the river. Many of them were forced into the water itself, and some of them drowned, and some of them were shot by the Nazis. But in general, they were pushing the Jews out. And this again fits into the functionalist school of thought, that the final solution had not yet been decided on. Because otherwise, they would not have driven the Jews out. They would have kept them here to kill them. So the Polish nobility was enormously wealthy and also enormously politically powerful. The Polish kings were elected by the nobility. And it's one of the reasons why the Poles view themselves as, having a democratic tradition. They wrote a constitution in 1793. I think it was mentioned in the museum tour that we did in Warsaw. That was a very liberal democratic constitution, never really implemented because of the partitions. But they view themselves as having a democratic tradition, and some of it goes back to the fact that the noblemen elected the king. It also meant that the noblemen often controlled the king. It's one of the reasons why Polish kings were often not very powerful. Of course, a lot of their wealth came from agriculture, from the lands that they owned, the towns that they owned, which was very typical at that time. And as was mentioned in the museum, Jews often worked as the agents of the noblemen and were the people who had to manage the estates, who had to collect taxes from the peasants, etc. And you can understand that that dynamic meant that there would also be tremendous resentment against the Jews, and that didn't work in our favor. There's a story about Count Potocki that's quite remarkable. He was always known as a friend of the Jews. Count Potocki's son converted to Judaism. This was rare at the time. It was also punishable by death. And he was indeed executed for having converted to Judaism. He is known in our tradition as the Ger Tzedek. He was buried in Vilna, where he had fled. And he was buried in the Jewish cemetery in Vilna. And after the war, when the communists destroyed most of the Vilna Jewish cemetery, just as they destroyed the Maharshal Shul in Lublin to build a road, they destroyed most of the Jewish cemetery. The Jewish community was able to reinter 7 graves from the cemetery. Of course, the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, was one of them. The Ger Tzedek was another one. You might be wondering, where did David Bernstein take us? A little off the beaten track. It'll soon become apparent. In truth, I've been taking all of my groups here for the last couple of years since I learned about this place and this story. And the story is connected to the very complex issue of Polish-Jewish relations. One of the most important discussions to take place in Polish society began in 2000 when Professor Jan Gross of New York University, now of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, Professor Jan Gross wrote a book called Neighbors. Neighbors is a book of about 150 pages. It tells the story of a small village about an hour away from Tykocin in northeastern Poland. And our guide in the Warsaw Museum mentioned it very, very briefly. About 1,500 Jews were murdered by their Polish neighbors, not by the Nazis. Most of them were murdered in a barn where they were locked in and the barn was put on fire. And according to Professor Jan Gross, more than half the adult male population of the town took part in the murder of their neighbors, the Jews of Yedvabna. And Yedvabna was not alone. We know of about a dozen similar cases in that region of northeastern Poland. And so despite the fact that I will say again and again that the final solution was the creation of the Nazis, they implemented it, the vast majority of Polish Jews were murdered by the Germans. Nonetheless, the historical truth is that there were places like Yedvabna. Needless to say, there were also cases where Poles collaborated with the Nazis and informed on Jews. They were offered rewards for that: alcohol, meat, part of the plunder of Jewish property, money. And we spoke when we were at Treblinka about how those who escaped from Treblinka, many of them were either informed upon or murdered by local Polish peasants. Those things are all true, and whatever else we're going to say here is not meant to deny a word of it. But the picture is complex. It's not so simple. Because while the vast majority of Poles, who again suffered under the Nazis themselves, were indifferent to Jewish suffering, there were also courageous Poles who rescued Jews. I mentioned briefly, and I want to go back to it when we were at the museum on our first or second day, Irena Sendler. Irena Sendler, who rescued 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto, a Catholic social worker working for a Catholic relief agency, Żegota, that was founded a little bit too late, but nonetheless worked to help Jews during the Shoah. And the amazing thing is that she kept the names of every child and their parents, buried it under a tree, so that if after the war the children or the parents might survive, they might be reunited after the war. This was not somebody who was saving Jewish lives in order to baptize them. Irena Sendler is certainly one of Chasidei Mota Olam and really a hero, and probably should have been given the Nobel Peace Prize. Trying to understand Polish-Jewish relations is so complex that I once heard a lecture by Dr. David Silberklang, who is a senior historian at Yad Vashem. And David Silberklang talked about the Polish town of Belz, B-E-L-Z, as in Belz Hasidim. And he told two stories about Belz. He told a story of December 1939, when a group of Jews are forcibly marched from somewhere else to Belz. And the local priest tells the women of Belz to help these Jews. And they bring them blankets, and they bring them food, and they bring them hot drinks. But then a year and a half later, the Nazis come back. They drive, the Jews flee. The vast majority of the Jews were able to flee. Some elderly Jews remained. In the same Belz, a year and a half later, the local Polish neighbors ransacked the Jewish homes and murdered the elderly Jews who had not fled. Same Belz, same town. This is what I mean by complex. It's easy to say, all the Poles hated the Jews, they're all guilty like the Germans. Or it's easy to say, you have to understand, It was a very difficult time. There were many courageous Poles. It's easy to say one side or the other, to make it white or black. There's only one problem with it. It's not truth. Because the truth is more complex. Why did we come to this particular farmhouse? This farmhouse was owned by a couple, Victoria and Joseph Ulma. They were two Polish Catholics who lived here in Markowa. July 1942, that terrible year, 1942, most of the 120 Jews are taken to an animal burial ground and murdered there. Some escape. And they find refuge in various homes of their neighbors. I want to remind you, the penalty for aiding a Jew in Poland under Nazi rule, even giving them a loaf of bread, was death to you and to your family. The Ulma family, Victoria and Joseph Ulma, had 6 children. The oldest one was in 2nd grade. They were devout Catholics. He was an amateur photographer. He had an advanced education, and he had learned advanced agricultural methods for use in his farm. And one day, 8 Jewish people knock on the door of the Ulmas. They're actually Jews from nearby Lancut, where we just were. And they had been in hiding, and fearing that their place was going to be discovered, they thought it would be safer not to be in the city, but to be in a village, in a farmhouse. They didn't know the Ulmas. The Ulmas didn't know them. There were 2 Goldman sisters. I think they were the Goldman and Shaw families. One of them had 6 people, the other one had 2 sisters. And they came here and they knocked on their door. And they asked if they could find refuge with them. And the Ulmas took them in. Now the Goldman and Shaw families had left behind property in Lancut. And they had left it behind under the care of a local policeman, a Polish policeman, whose last name was Lesh, L-E-S. And when they came here, they tried to get word back to Lesh that they wanted him to bring their property here. This Polish policeman obviously wanted to keep their property. And so he then informed the Germans about this hideout of the Goldman and Shaw families. And early on a March morning, before dawn, a group of German soldiers come here to this farmhouse. They found the Goldman and Shaw families, and they murdered them on the spot. They then turned to Joseph and Victoria Ulma, and they murdered them in front of their screaming children. Victoria Ulma was pregnant, about to give birth with her 7th child. They then, according to one source, began a discussion about what to do with the children. And they decided to murder the children. And so here, the Ulma family, the Shaw family, and the Goldman family were murdered on one March morning. But the story doesn't end there. The next morning, the next day, 24 hours later, 24 Jewish corpses are found in the fields of Markowa. Why?
As a lesson to be shown. Yeah, teach a lesson.
No.
They were scared.
They were
Who?
afraid if they were hiding.
That were hiding them.
They were hiding.
There were other Poles in the area who were hiding Jews. And they understood that they could be next. They couldn't just let the Jews go, because then if the Jews were captured under torture, they might reveal how they were being helped, who was helping them. And therefore 24 Jewish corpses mysteriously appear in the fields 24 hours after the murder of the Ulma family. But it doesn't end there either. Because there were numerous families, Polish families, that did not murder their Jews that they were hiding and kept hiding them until the end of the war. All of this is true. All of it is true in all of its complexity. The Ulma family was recognized posthumously by Yad Vashem as Chasidei Umot HaOlam. There is a small museum honoring the Ulma family here. The local elementary school has been named the Ulma Servants of God Elementary School. I'll share one more story again to add more complexity to this. The same Professor Jan Gross of NYU and now the Institute for Advanced Study, after he wrote Neighbors and caused a whole tremendous debate in Polish society about what was our role during the Shoah, a debate that couldn't take place and didn't take place under the communists. And that debate, by the way, continues. This small village of Jedwabne that probably 90% of Poles never heard of. After 2000, 90% of Poles knew about this little village of Jedwabne because of that terrible story. The same Professor Jan Gross wrote another book called Fear, Anti-Semitism After Auschwitz, about what happened in Poland immediately after the liberation, immediately after the Nazis were driven out. And I've mentioned already the Kielce pogrom and other pogroms and threats against Jews which drove most of the survivors out of Poland, ironically, to Germany, to DP camps in Germany. That's where Jews could find safe haven, ironically. Jan Gross, in his book, Fear, Anti-Semitism After Auschwitz, tells the following story. He tells the story of two brothers who were hidden by a Polish family for an extended period of time. And one day the father of the Polish family comes to their hiding place. It was in a barn. And he tells them, you can come out safely now. The Germans have retreated. They come out, and he takes out a bottle of vodka, and he pours, and he says, the Polish equivalent of, let's make a l'chaim. And they're standing there, the three of them, after this terrible ordeal that they all went through, and breathing a very big sigh of relief. And the Polish rescuer, after he drinks his vodka, says to them, I have one request of you. They say, what is it? We owe you our lives. He says, please don't tell anyone that I saved you. He said, I fear that my neighbors will not understand. And he tells many other stories like this. So when I say that we don't know the total number of rescuers, it's for many reasons. And all of these things are true. And all of them present one very complex picture.
To have 6 kids of your own and take in 8 people in there, it's like an extra level of righteousness.
But also the maliciousness of the policeman. Like, he could have said, he didn't even have to do anything. You know, ignore the call or whatever and just keep the stuff.
One of the reasons that Professor Jan Gross says that anti-Semitism was so great after the war, one of the reasons, there were more, was that Jewish property had either been placed in the hands of Polish neighbors, or Jews had been driven out of the homes and had abandoned their property, and Poles had moved in to their homes, to their shops, to their factories. And now, a few years later, their great fear was the Jews would return and they would take it back.
It says something about, again, this question yesterday, we talked about our own consciousness, where would we fall? There's something corrupt within you if even after the fact, when you have no fear and there is no consequence to you, you still can't restore to people their dignity or show kindness.
Because you're greedy.
So but that greed is corrupt.
It wasn't just that the Danes refused to let their Jews be touched, be taken, be victimized, and save them, and transported them in a clandestine way to neutral Sweden. Or, as in Copenhagen, the doctors and nurses conspired together to put Jews as patients in bed, to hide them in supply rooms in the basements. But I heard a Dane tell us, my students and myself, years ago, that as absurd as it sounds, when the Jews were taken and their homes and the apartments were left empty, their neighbors fed the pets and watered the plants. It sounds almost absurd to say that they were watering plants and feeding their pets. And when the Danish Jews returned from Sweden, they found everything intact, everything cared for. And to this day, I cannot find the understanding in any research that was done or in any book that was written of how you can have two societies very close together. It took us an hour to fly from Copenhagen to Warsaw. There's a part of Denmark that borders Germany. So they share an artificial border. There's no river, there's no mountain range. And how do you explain that on one side of the border they wanted to annihilate Jews, and on the other side of the border they fed the pets and they watered the plants?
Joyce and I were schmoozing with Akiva, and we were asking him what he's doing next week. He said he has another tour of Poland that he's giving another group. And he said, but it's better because next week my wife will be here also. So we said to him, oh, is she also joining you on the group? He said, no, she's bringing a family from Israel, a private tour. And we said, oh, they're just here to do what we're doing, but privately? He said, no, they're here with their lawyers to get their house back. 70 years later, you tell me those Polish people who live in that house are going to be singing Am Yisrael Chai when these Israelis come to take their house back? So things haven't changed so much in 70 years about us asking our property back.
I have to say, I have trouble with, maybe you've already noticed it, I have trouble with the national branding of things, because I think people are people, and there are good people and bad people amongst every people, including ourselves, and we know that. And we haven't talked too much about it, but there were Jewish informers and there were Jewish collaborators.
One last thought, because I've been sitting here struggling with the dichotomy between this magnificent view on this side and the evil that was perpetrated in this spot, and how do you reconcile the two? And it occurs to me, and this is a thought in process, so before anyone jumps on me, that the view and the landscape was provided by God. It's a blank slate, the world. The world is filled with magnificent views. God created it, it's a blank slate. What happens on it, that's done by man. And so the way to reconcile it is that the view, the backdrop, the atmosphere, that's the Ribono Shalom. God creates the view. What happens on it is the free will of man, and it's the evil of man.